What if the land itself could speak? What stories would the mountains whisper or the deserts sigh? Because Chile isn't just a country, it's a ribbon of earth stretched between fire and ice, a nation that has lived through conquest, dictatorship, rebellion, and rebirth. It's one of the most unequal societies in Latin America, yet also one of the most advanced. It's a country rich in lithium, copper, and power, but haunted by voices that refuse to be silenced. So how did this narrow strip of land become home to some of the world's most resilient people? How did a nation of contrasts, rich and poor, north and south, old and new, come to define the soul of South America itself? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see how Chile's story is one of survival, not just against invaders or dictators, but against time itself. Before we begin, drop a comment below. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Chile? The Andes, the protests, or the mysteries of Easter Island? Let's see what story the world remembers. Long before anyone called it Chile, this land was already alive. Thousands of years before European ships ever touched its coasts, indigenous peoples thrived here, hunters, gatherers, and warriors who built their homes in deserts, valleys, and forests. In the north, the Atacameños and Diaguita cultivated the driest desert on Earth, coaxing life from soil that hadn't felt rain in decades. In the central valleys, fertile lands were shared by tribes like the Pinochet and Promaucae, each with traditions tied to the stars and the rhythm of the seasons. But in the south, there was a people no empire could ever truly conquer, the Mapuche. Their name meant people of the land. They didn't just live on it, they were it. They believed that when you harmed the earth, you harmed yourself. They worshipped the forest spirits, respected the animals, and fought fiercely for their territory. When the Inca Empire swept through the Andes in the 15th century, their armies reached into what's now northern Chile and stopped. Because beyond the Rapel River, the Mapuche stood like a wall. They fought off the Incas, and centuries later, they do the same to the Spanish. So even before Chile had a name, it had a spirit, defiant, independent, unbroken. The year was 1520. A Portuguese explorer named Ferdinand Magellan was steering his fleet through a wild, unknown passage at the edge of the world. Freezing winds tore through his sails. Icy peaks loomed on both sides. He had no idea he was charting a route that would one day carry his name, the Strait of Magellan. When he finally reached what's now Chiloé Island, he saw smoke rising from native fires and waves crashing against jagged rocks. He didn't know it then, but he'd just glimpsed a land that would defy empires. The Spanish followed soon after. In 1535, Diego de Almagro, one of Francisco Pizarro's men, led an expedition south from Peru, dreaming of gold and glory. But Chile gave him nothing. No gold, no easy riches, just cold, hunger, resistance, and loss. His men marched through deserts that stretched endlessly. Horses died. Food ran out. The land itself felt hostile, like it didn't want them there. After nearly 3 fruitless years, Almagro turned back. It wasn't until 1541 that another conquistador, Pedro de Valdivia, tried again. He founded Santiago, a city that would one day become Chile's capital, though at first it was little more than a fort surrounded by enemies. Because while the Spanish raised crosses and banners, the Mapuche raised spears and fire. They attacked, burned, and rebuilt. It was one of the longest and bloodiest resistances in all of the Americas, a 300-year war that defined Chile's soul. If you've made it this far, type Mapuche in the comments. Let's honor the first defenders of Chilean land. Valdivia himself was eventually captured by the Mapuche and executed. The Spanish called them savages, but history remembers them as heroes, warriors who refused to kneel. The Spanish crown eventually carved Chile into its empire, but it was always a tough land to rule. Unlike the wealthy mines of Peru or Mexico, Chile offered little gold. Its wealth lay hidden in soil, timber, and the endurance of its people. Colonial Chile became a place of stark contrasts. Enormous estates were owned by a handful of families, while indigenous communities were displaced, their lands absorbed by haciendas. The Catholic Church grew powerful. The Mapuche were pushed south, where they continued to resist from forests and mountains. And in that slow-burning tension, a new identity was forming, one that wasn't quite Spanish anymore, and not fully indigenous either. It was Chilean. A culture of stubborn pride, faith, and survival emerged. Songs told of lost battles and unbroken hearts. And far from the centers of power, a unique mix of Spanish, indigenous, and African influences shaped the nation's rhythm. Chile was the empire's edge, but that edge would soon turn into a blade. By the late 1700s, the flames of revolution had begun spreading across the Americas. From Haiti to Mexico, colonies were rising against European control, and in Chile, whispers of rebellion began to echo through Santiago's narrow streets. In 1810, Chile declared its first step toward independence, not yet a full break from Spain, but the spark had been lit. It would take 8 years of war, blood, and betrayal to finish the job. Bernardo O'Higgins, the son of an Irish-Spanish officer, and José de San Martín, an Argentine general, led the liberation forces. They crossed the Andes, a journey so brutal that nearly half their men didn't survive. But in 1818, after the Battle of Maipú, Chile was finally free. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a statement. This land belongs to no king, no empire. It belongs to its people. But freedom wasn't peace. The new republic was fractured, torn between centralists and federalists, liberals and conservatives, the rich elite and the struggling poor. Yet even amid chaos, Chile began to grow. Trade expanded. Cities modernized, schools and universities opened. The dream of a modern republic took root, but only for some. Freedom came at a price. When Chile won its independence in 1818, the dream of liberty was fresh, raw, and fragile. There were no clear rules, no united vision, just ambition. The new republic struggled to define itself. Would it be ruled by a strong central government, or would each region govern its own destiny? Would the church keep its grip, or would secular voices shape the future? Every answer came with conflict. Coups, civil wars, and revolts. Chile's 19th century was a tug-of-war between order and freedom, but amid the chaos, Chile built something remarkable: a professional army, a modern education system. By the mid-1800s, it was one of the most stable nations in South America. It also began to expand. In the War of the Pacific, 1879-1884, Chile fought against Peru and Bolivia, a brutal conflict over nitrate-rich deserts. When the dust settled, Chile had won. It seized vast territories from both neighbors, gaining the Atacama Desert, a region that would later power its economy with minerals and, today, lithium. But victory came with consequences. Bolivia lost its coast, becoming landlocked, a wound that still burns today, and Chile's sense of destiny grew, perhaps too much. Because while it looked outward for expansion, it turned inward with control. The Mapuche resistance was finally crushed in the late 1800s. Their lands were seized, their forests cut, and though Chile called it pacification, history calls it what it was: occupation. Pause here for a second. If your ancestors lost their land for the sake of progress, how would you define victory? Comment your thoughts. History is full of both pride and pain. By the dawn of the 20th century, Chile was changing. Steamships carried copper, nitrates, and wheat to Europe. Santiago's elite walked boulevards inspired by Paris, while in the mines of the north, workers lived in shacks made of tin. It was a nation of opposites, the rich and the invisible, the powerful and the forgotten. The early 1900s saw the rise of labor movements. Workers began to demand rights, fair pay, safe conditions, dignity. But every time they rose, the government sent soldiers. In 1907, in the northern city of Iquique, thousands of striking miners gathered peacefully in a schoolyard. They were unarmed, hungry. The army opened fire. Hundreds, maybe thousands, were killed. It became one of Chile's darkest chapters, known as the Santa Maria School Massacre. For decades, Official records buried it. But memory never died. Chileans passed the story quietly, like a secret that refused to fade, and that memory, of inequality, of resistance, would come back generations later. Meanwhile, Chile's politics swung like a pendulum. Reformers rose and fell, presidents changed, constitutions rewritten. Through wars, earthquakes, and economic shocks, Chile endured. But beneath the calm surface, the tension was growing. By the mid-20th century, new ideas had arrived: socialism, communism, capitalism, each promising to fix what the last one broke. And one man would soon test them all. It was 1970. The world was in turmoil: Vietnam, Cold War, student revolutions, and in Chile, something historic happened. A doctor named Salvador Allende won the presidency, not by force, but by vote. He became the first democratically elected Marxist leader in Latin America. His dream? To build a country where workers had power, where land was shared, where the poor could live with dignity. He called it the Chilean road to socialism. Factories were nationalized, schools opened in poor areas, land was redistributed from the rich to the farmers who worked it. Hope filled the streets, but so did fear. Wealthy families fled. Business owners protested. The US government, terrified of another Cuba, moved in the shadows, cutting trade, funding opposition, and sowing division. Soon, the economy collapsed. Food shortages, inflation, strikes, chaos spread, and in the midst of it all, a young general began to rise, Augusto Pinochet. Allende trusted him, but on September 11, 1973, the betrayal came. Jets screamed over Santiago. Tanks rolled through the streets. The presidential palace, La Moneda, went up in flames. Allende's final broadcast echoed across the airwaves, his voice calm, defiant. "I will not resign. I will pay for loyalty to the people with my life." Moments later, he was gone. Whether he took his own life or was killed remains debated. But one thing is certain: democracy died that day. The years that followed were some of the darkest in Chile's history. General Augusto Pinochet seized power and ruled for 17 years. The country became a laboratory for extreme economic reform: privatization, deregulation, free market shock therapy. Foreign investors cheered. The stock market soared. But beneath the surface, fear reigned. Tens of thousands were imprisoned, exiled, or disappeared. Families waited for loved ones who never came home. Music was censored, art destroyed, voices silenced. It wasn't just political, it was psychological. A collective trauma. People learned to whisper in their own houses. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Truth became dangerous. Quick moment: if you're still here, type "never forget." Because stories like these shouldn't fade into statistics. They are warnings, written in blood. Yet even in those years of terror, resistance survived. Students painted secret murals in alleyways. Mothers marched silently every week, holding pictures of their missing children. And by the late 1980s, the world began to notice. In 1988, Chileans were given a simple choice. Yes, keep Pinochet. No, demand change. For the first time in years, the people's voice mattered again. The campaign for no became a movement of hope. Musicians, artists, families, everyone joined. And when the votes were counted, no had won. Pinochet stepped down. Reluctantly, democracy returned. But not everything he built disappeared. His 1980 constitution remained. His economic model stayed. His supporters still held power in courts, companies, and Congress. Chile was free again, but its freedom was built on fragile ground. The 1990s in Chile began with cautious hope. The dictatorship had ended, but its shadow still loomed. The streets were quiet, but not healed. The wounds were deep, invisible, and everywhere. President Patricio Aylwin, the first democratically elected leader after Pinochet, promised truth and reconciliation. And though commissions were created, many crimes stayed buried. The country had to choose between justice and stability, and often it chose the latter. Still, life began to change. Chile opened to the world. New malls, highways, universities, and skyscrapers transformed Santiago into a symbol of progress. By the 2000s, Chile was celebrated as a Latin American success story, stable, modern, booming. But success has a hidden cost, because while the skyline grew taller, the gap between rich and poor widened. The elite dined on imported wine, while entire families in the South lived paycheck to paycheck. Education was privatized, healthcare was expensive, and the promise of equality, the dream that fueled independence, revolution, and democracy, still hadn't arrived. The people didn't forget. They waited. On February 27, 2010, Chile was hit by one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded, magnitude 8.8. It was so powerful, scientists said it shortened Earth's day by a fraction of a second. Buildings crumbled, the sea rose, but Chile stood tall. Within days, power was restored. Roads reopened. The world watched in awe as a nation scarred by dictatorship showed what resilience looked like. But under that resilience, something was building. Pressure, frustration, anger. Because even after surviving the Earth's fury, Chileans were still battling social earthquakes every day. Low wages, student debt, rising costs. People were surviving, not living. And by 2019, that pressure finally exploded. It started small. A metro fare increase, 30 pesos, that's less than 5 cents. But it wasn't about the money, it was about dignity. Students began jumping subway turnstiles in protest. Police responded with force. Then the streets filled with millions. From Santiago to Valparaiso, people marched, banged pots, waved flags, sang songs of unity. Elderly women, teenagers, teachers, workers, different generations, same cry. It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. 30 years of inequality, broken promises, and silent pain. The government declared a state of emergency. Soldiers filled the streets, the first time since Pinochet. But this time, Chileans didn't back down. They faced tear gas and rubber bullets with songs and candles, walls filled with graffiti, until dignity becomes habit. Chile woke up. The protests forced the government to listen and to promise what many thought impossible: a new constitution. For the first time in its history, Chileans were asked a question: do you want a new constitution? Almost 80% said yes. Hope surged again. The drafting began, led by ordinary people, not politicians. Women, indigenous representatives, activists, students. Voices that had never been heard now shaped the nation's future. But writing a new country is harder than protesting one. The draft was ambitious. Gender equality, environmental rights, indigenous autonomy. Too ambitious for some. And in 2022, when the proposed constitution went to a vote, it was rejected. Disappointment hit hard, but Chile didn't give up. Another process began, another draft, another chance. And through it all, one truth became clear. This wasn't failure. It was democracy learning to walk again. Today, Chile stands at a crossroads. It's one of the most developed nations in South America, yet inequality remains high. It's rich in natural resources, copper, lithium, solar energy, but haunted by questions of who truly benefits. The world looks to Chile for the future of clean energy because the lithium in its deserts powers the batteries of electric cars and smartphones. But locals in the Atacama ask, if the world is going green, why are our rivers running dry? Progress and preservation. It's a battle Chile knows too well. Still, hope remains alive. You can see it in the murals of Santiago, in the laughter of Mapuche children learning their language again, in the young women leading climate marches. Because Chile isn't just a country, it's a reminder that no matter how deep the scars of history, people can always rise again. From the Andes to the Pacific, from copper mines to vineyards, from the darkness of dictatorship to the dawn of democracy, Chile's story is one of survival. A nation carved by earth, by fire, and by the stubborn will of its people. It has been conquered, liberated, divided, and reborn again and again. Maybe that's what makes Chile, Chile. A land where memory is not buried, it is carried, where every scar is a story, and every generation, no matter how broken, still believes in something better. If you felt something watching this, don't just scroll away. History isn't meant to stay in textbooks. It's meant to remind us who we are. Hit like if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. Comment, Chile woke up, if you stand for justice, memory, and hope. And subscribe, because next week we travel to another nation whose past still burns in its present. Until then, stay curious, stay awake, and remember, the future belongs to those who never stop rewriting it.